Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon session on providing clean energy in fragile states. I'm Sara Pantuliano, I'm the Chief Executive of ODI in London, and I'm really delighted to be moderating these conversations this afternoon because this is such a critical topic. Let's think about the scale of the challenge. There are an estimated 2 billion people living in fragile environments, whether for environmental or climatic reasons or because of conflict and violence. These people, to live more prosperous and dignified lives, need to have access to a number of resources. Now, reliable energy is one of that. Reliable electricity is fundamental, to them, living better lives. This is a challenge that the Forum is trying to help address through its humanitarian investing initiative, which is an initiative that is really focused to bring together public and private actors to try and develop new approaches to people living in fragile environments and protracted crises. UNHCR, the High Commission has just joined us. It's all right. Has actually very recently at the Global Refugee Forum in December launched the challenge, the Clean Energy Challenge, that is actually committed UNHCR and a number of its partners to make clean energy affordable, available to all refugee settings and host communities. And we'll hear more about this in a minute. Now, this sounds really ambitious and perhaps really challenging, but if you think about it, renewable energy technologies are actually easier to deploy in fragile environments. They're more versatile, they're potentially cheaper in terms of both startup cost and maintenance cost. They're less susceptible to price volatility than gas, diesel, and other fossil fuels. In theory, they could be deployed at smaller scale, and they're also more inclusive because we know that more women are involved in sort of the green energy economy than they are in the brown fossil fuel economy. But there are also challenges. We were just discussing that with the panel before we started, so we'll explore them together in a minute. And we are really, lucky to have privileged to have such a great group of panelists to discuss, this challenge. Let me introduce them right away. Let's start with His Excellency Vincent Biruta, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Rwanda. Further to my left is Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And right next to me, José Manuel Entre Canales Domecq, who is the Chairman and CEO of Acciona. And then last but not least, we have Kaya Gobodo, who is the Managing Director for Wealth and Investments of Old Mutual in South Africa. So a great diversity of government, businesses, and international organizations represented here to help us explore these issues. Welcome also to the people in the audience and those who are online. This is a televised sessions. Feel free to tweet using the WEF20 app so that we can generate the conversation online as well. Minister Biruta, let me start with you. So what can governments really do to help incentivize investors to come and really try and scale up the amount of clean energy sort of technology that we have in country?
Yes, my government is doing a lot actually to bring in investors. As you know, Rwanda is ranking very high in doing business report of the World Bank. This year it was second in Africa and 38th in the world. So we have put in place mechanisms to make investing very easy, and those incentives are very many, but some of them are related to just creating a conducive environment in terms of registering a company, in terms of accessing basic infrastructure like electricity or water supply. And we have also invested a lot in fighting corruption, of course. And this is the reason why Rwanda is ranking very high, and we aim at doing even better. And one of the sectors which are of interest is, of course, the energy sector. Today, 53% of our households have access to electricity, are connected to electricity. 39% are connected to the grid, while 14% are off-grid. So we have a plan to reach 100% access to electricity in 2024. And this is ambitious, but we are investing, and we are investing in renewable energy. And as far as incentives are concerned for the energy sector, other incentives are of course related to tax holidays for depending on the volume of the investment you are making, but energy is high on the agenda in terms of incentives, because we understand that energy is a driver for very many other sectors, for industrialization, for economic development in general. And when we say clean energy, we mean that we also targeting, we are also trying to address air pollution, because in our country, in many African countries, people are cooking with wood. It is firewood or charcoal, and it is causing deforestation, but it is also causing indoor air pollution with many health-related consequences. So this is the reason why we are heavily investing in energy, and we think that by 2024 everybody will have electricity, but everybody will have also a clean cooking solution.
And what response have you had from investors? I mean, have you actually managed to, attract investors that they see this as, sort of a conducive business, to scale up in Rwanda and other parts of the region?
So we have put in place a series of measures. One of them are related to the tax holidays, others are related to just creating a conducive environment when we deal with corruption, and investors understand that they can come and no one is going to ask them to pay, bribe or anything. So they are happy. Of course, there is the general environment which is related to the security and the safety of the people, and this is very important. And I would also say that more than 50% of our energy is generated by independent power producers. And that is important, and we, as a government, we actually also privatizing some investment we have done as a government. So the private sector is at the center of our strategy, and we need to create all these conditions which are really likely to attract investors and to incentivize those who are already in place.
So let me come to the investors. Let me come to Jose first and then Kaya. Are these incentives enough? What does your company need to really be incentivized to scale up the investment in countries like Rwanda and countries that are perhaps even more challenging than Rwanda?
Well, there are a number of difficulties at this stage. And let's put things into context first. I mean, we've gone from 1.3 billion people without access, what was it, 2013, 14, to below 800 in 2019. So it's a very significant improvement, that's globally. So things are moving forward. As you go down in that number, things get more difficult because you're accessing poorer communities, because you're accessing more distant communities, because all sorts of reasons. However, the problem is that according to the International Energy Agency, that trend is going to change, and with population growth in the next decade, by 2030, we're going to be back in the above billion, highly above billion number of non-access people. So that needs to be addressed very, very carefully. And there is a basic statement that I'd like to make, and I think we share because we discussed it before, is that you can only solve so much through a philanthropic approach. A philanthropic approach is fantastic, it's great, it's needed, it's definitely to be thankful, but it only will reach a certain amount. You need to develop some sort of a business model behind the full access in order for it to maintain itself, to grow naturally. And naturally, obviously, that the poorer the community, the less margin for a business approach to be in place. Our experience, Acciona is a renewable energy company, among other sustainability infrastructures, but we are mostly renewable energy company. And our experience in depressed areas, in very poor areas, has been mostly in Latin America, where the conditions are a little bit better. Not hugely better, because some areas of the Amazon are extreme. 5 hours by boat on the river to reach. So very limited, very challenging conditions. And there, we've managed to create, in most cases, to create the basics of a business. That is, start with a philanthropic approach, a .org type of approach, and then create the mechanism, often through government subsidies to the end users, so that they can afford they can afford to actually purchase the electricity and make it a normal
Sustainable
access mechanism. But that can reach, say, maximum 10% of the income. In normal circumstances, it would be 5% of the disposable income for electricity is the limit. So if you're talking about very low income, then the whole mechanism doesn't fly from the point of view of business. And that's when the governments need to come in and develop a subsidy mechanism so that it doesn't reach that 5%. It maintains itself within that 5% of the total income. It also depends, and with this I finish, I know my answer can. Yeah. It also depends what type of a community you're accessing. If you're accessing big communities, then utility scale renewables is possibly a lot more efficient. I mean, you have to take into consideration that home solar type of energy, that would be producing a kilowatt hour at a cost of anywhere between $70, so a megawatt hour, which is more commonly used, a megawatt hour, it'd be $700 to $1,000 per megawatt hour. To put it into context, this is a technical number that probably doesn't say anything to anyone, but to put it into context, the electricity we use in any Western country, utility scale, efficiently sun a plant, will cost, the production of that will cost something like 30 euros a megawatt hour. So this is a factor of 60 times more expensive to produce because of the scale. So it's a conundrum there where we're producing by the technology we have, and that is cheaper than any other technology that we have access to, not to mention the environmental impact of using fuel or coal.
You're basically saying unless there is some serious blended structured capital, it can't happen.
So if you use utility scale, you need to address very big communities. If you use home solar, you have to address smaller communities. If you use mini grids, you can use refugee camps, but then refugee camps need to have a constant demand in order to make that investment viable. So it's a very much tailored solution that needs to be applied. And the underlying, with this I really finish, and the underlying secret is try to make a business case out of it. And that will attract capital.
It's a perfect segue for mine, because that's what they do. So tell us what works, in terms of bringing investors to the table, because, Jose is making a very important point. So how do you get around it?
Yeah, just a little bit of context. One of our major subsidiaries is it's called the Africa Infrastructure Investment Managers. So very much a part of this conversation. We manage about $2 billion in the infrastructure space, and about half of that portfolio is in energy, and about 60% of the energy piece is in renewable energy. So this is an area we've been in for 20 years, and I think we understand reasonably well. Now here's the conundrum. 100% of our investors are institutional investors who require some level of acceptable risk-adjusted return. So these are European investors, American investors, South African investors, Pan-African investors, as well as Asian investors. That's the investor group where we raise the capital that we can deploy into the space. And so what have we found? What are the conditions that are necessary for us, one, to attract that capital and therefore to deploy it in a way that's acceptable to those investors? One, there is the environmental issue. When I say environmental, I mean in the region in which you're allocating capital. One, a very clearly understood regulatory framework around energy policy. The clearer it is, the better understood it is, the greater the likelihood of attracting capital, number one. Number two, you need state institutions that are involved in this ecosystem that have sufficient capacity. So you want people who are running these programs and interacting with the Accionas and the AIMS and others of the world who really understand. And you can ring fence them and put the right level of skills in there. The other are some important risk mitigants, right? And these will include things like certainty around revenue. So a lot of the work that we do, we ultimately sell back into the grid, right? And so an arrangement where there's some certainty around what the revenue outcome is going to be is call it an important key. And the last two are a contracting framework, right, that is both understood and executable. Right? You want to know that if you agree something with a counterparty, the contracting framework allows you to go back and say, well, you haven't performed your part, and there's some reasonable recourse around that. And we found that if those conditions are true, you're able to attract quite a lot of capital. I mean, the South African case, if I can just use a subset of our overall portfolio, we had a renewable energy program that attracted, in 4 rounds, attracted something like $25 billion in capital into that space. And in fact, firms like Acciona, global organizations, were real participants into that space. So those are some of the basic conditions that are necessary. Now, how do you take what I've just described and apply it in substantially more fragile environments? Right? That's the key.
My question.
How do you take what works at scale, right, on-grid, off-take arrangements with big government-backed distribution kind of infrastructure and provide it in the kinds of environments that we're talking about today? I think one of the basic keys is, if you want to attract this kind of capital, the risk mitigants have to change substantially. The level of concessionary capital in the stack of capital that's required has to be very different, right? If you look at the South African example I gave, there's no concessionary capital at all, right? Because the business case, the overall economics actually work, right? The more fragile the circumstances become, the greater the level of concessionary capital you require in order to make it work. And then the other one is doing it at scale is better than doing it at subscale, because if you're doing it at if you're counting individual households in the hundreds, I mean, the kinds of solutions we're discussing are near impossible. So you need to find a way to do it at some level of scale that makes it doable.
Okay, well, let me come to Filippo, because what you're saying is, unless we get, and both of you are saying, unless we get some serious concessionary capital, this is not going to happen. So your clean energy challenge would be a real challenge if you want to implement, unless we can really mobilize this capital. And we know that international organizations, humanitarian organizations are not the best place in terms of capacity to help this dialogue between, if you want, public capital and private investors, and even within donor organizations, we see that there is a real challenge to really be able to de-risk this kind of investment at scale. So what can we do to really make sure that we are better prepared to really help these deals happen?
I'm not so sure if international organizations like mine, humanitarian organizations, are not the best are not well placed for dialogue. I think dialogue is always easy. It's the solutions that are difficult, and that's something else. Actually, we are offering dialogue, but we need solutions. That's the crux of the matter. And we've been discussing in the last couple of days here quite a lot. Just for everybody's knowledge, this is very much a small niche of the much bigger problem that has been discussed up to now. You know, I represent here the refugee organization. We have a challenge. The challenge is that, as we know and was already mentioned, in many places, usually fragile context, large numbers of people on the move cause damage to the environment. There's no question about that. If any of you goes to Bangladesh, to where 1 million Rohingya refugees have arrived from Myanmar, you will see the devastation. You can't blame the refugees for that. It's just a necessity, especially in the initial phase of this big crisis. People go out and cut wood because there's no other way to heat and to cook. And you know, it sounds almost archaic in this day and age, but this is a reality. This is a reality in many parts of Africa. It is, unfortunately, a reality. Now, we've known this reality for years, for many years. And we've always tried to respond with, to use the language of a previous speaker, philanthropic solutions. So we try to get a little bit of money to provide cleaner energy, gas, or other solutions, better cooking facilities. This was the traditional approach. We can't cope with that anymore. Not in a global context of climate emergency, where the fragile areas are the most impacted, and this impacts even more, not only the refugees, but also the communities and the countries hosting them. So we launched recently, some of you may know, we had a big gathering of stakeholders of the refugee issue in all domains. One was about energy, and we launched a clean energy challenge. We said by 2030, among the many other things that we want to reach, can we try and aim for having clean energy, clean, affordable, sustainable energy in refugee settings? They're not all refugee settings, but in those where there is a need for that. And we think it's possible. We think it's possible. In fact, with some business partners, we have already done some fairly good work in Ethiopia with IKEA and in other places, for example. But I'm afraid that we still have to fall back to an element of philanthropy for that, meaning of aid, which is not bad because at least you shore up a problem, but that's not sustainable. And it's not scalable to the extent that is needed. This is where we have launched the challenge. Now, I have to say, Sarah, that it is I see where you're coming from. The challenge, as we discussed yesterday in our humanitarian investing group, the challenge is that it's not just a challenge of doing it. The challenge for organizations like mine is what to do exactly and how to get capital to do it. How to make projects that we are able to design to an extent investable. This is the big challenge. I would even say that the challenge is double. Resources and help us design investable programs. You know, energy can be sold. We can buy energy as an aid organization. So we don't completely get out of the aid conundrum, but instead of buying fuel for the generators or I don't know what, or keep spending money to reforest, which is a never-ending story, we could perhaps buy clean energy. And I'm sure that this is the beginning of a more virtuous cycle. That's all I can say, though, about investability. This is what we can do. But I think that it is possible to study more. In a way, as we heard from the minister and from you, the problem is much bigger. The problem, and yesterday at another meeting, somebody from South Africa raised a very important point. There's no purpose in identifying solutions that are just for small refugee settings. I agree. The best is that we promote the inclusion of refugees in national energy policies. But you have countries like Rwanda that are very virtuous and where we can do that, and we have great dialogue with Rwanda on all these things. But many other countries either do not have energy policies or, more often, do not want to include refugees in energy or in any national policy. So we have challenges there and emergencies that are very urgent to address.
Yeah, but both the minister and Caio want to come in.
No, let the minister by all means, please.
I just want to say that there is a cost of not doing something about
yes.
access to energy for
Absolutely.
refugees. Because we, at some point, need to reforest, and we put money for that. And we need to treat people who have been exposed to indoor air pollution, and we pay for that. So who should pay? I think it will be, we need to think about a mechanism which will bring in these international organizations, philanthropies, government. But the point is not doing anything about
Is more costly.
access, clean energy for refugees is really highly costly. And for some of the damages will not be recovered anyway. So if we lose life because people have been exposed to air pollution, lives are just lost. There is nothing you can do about it if you cannot put money and bring back these lives. So we need to do something about it. And to conclude, let me say that SDG 7 is about access to clean and affordable energy. If we don't do anything about refugee camps, it means that by 2030, there will be people who will be excluded from that. That will mean that we have missed our targets. Thank you.
Caio, and then I want to see if the audience wants to come in.
I mean, I can't underline the truth of the point that there are externalities that somebody's got to fund. And if you think about the constituencies involved, if you ask actors like us, and bearing in mind it's very easy to put a large corporate face to an institution like ours, the reality is that we are responsible for managing the life savings of ordinary citizens from across the world. And which means we owe them a very basic obligation to allocate their capital in a manner that is responsible. And at the same time, seeks to address the challenges that you've pointed out, Minister. And so if you look at renewable energy at scale with clear policies that are implemented in partnership with governments, there are very clearly successful models from around the world to the point that renewable energy at scale, especially in a place like South Africa, now costs less than baseload coal, right? Yeah. I mean, who would have thought of that when we did round one, almost a decade ago? So I would implore us to try to solve, in some instances, the big problem, because if you try to solve the big problem at scale, the residual answer, in many respects, is the solution that you require for those who are the most fragile, in that ecosystem.
But I think, as Filippo was saying, what we need, though, is really the help of businesses to, help build this pipeline of investable projects. I think, for us to really make the case to donors that, this is investable, that's what we can do. There isn't the expertise, if you would, in our, I also come from an organization that traditionally has, worked in the development and humanitarian space. That expertise is not there. So to make this work, we need, both the public and the private to work together very closely in, sort of building the investment theme. You want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say basically what you said. I mean, what Filippo's saying is obviously it's a small, relatively to the universal access refugee problems is a problem, but it's a smaller problem than the other one. It's a part of the problem. Now, for businesses, we just need, we don't help. We do it for profit. We will do, as soon as we see, we meaning the world business community, as soon as we see an opportunity, we will rush in there and we will try to find a solution. And if I would say, if I had to put one absolute necessity, is scale. So solving, like we're doing like we're helping to do the Jordan camp for Syrian refugees mostly, has to be a philanthropic or a learning experience, but because it's one case. If we learn there and our learning can be expanded to another 20 or 30 or 50 camps around the world, and that is what you find the scale, then it becomes a business line and an expertise, a vertical, let's say, solving refugees, electricity problems or energy problems. Then it becomes a business. So scalability, the prospect of scalability will move the business community as no other element.
Let me bring the audience in as well. I just want to see if there is any question or comment. We've got another 10 minutes. Yes, I see a hesitant hand. Please introduce yourself.
My name's Neil. I'm a global shaper from the Dhaka Hub. I work in the clean energy space. I've been working in the space for 6 years, primarily working on developing products. I was working in India on microgrids with the Rockefeller Foundation, and then later working on building peer-to-peer energy trading models for Bangladesh. I'm working on designing new systems for the space, primarily decentralized systems again. I do hear you, and I see the economies of scale here are very clear. But even when we look at, say, large-scale utilities in countries like, say, India and Bangladesh for that matter, because I can speak more about that context, utilities aren't doing very well, especially public utilities. Their revenue collections are fairly poor, and these utilities need to be bailed out every year in these contexts. And we spend over $2 billion in India itself to bail these utilities out. So maybe decentralization could help also in terms of revenue collections and trying to build new business models around this. So I would love to hear your thoughts around that as well.
Great. Other questions or comments? Very quiet audience. I know it's the end of the second day. We're starting to get tired, but come on, guys.
The same is happening in Kenya, for example, where there's been an enormous success in the growth. It's gone from penetration of 23% in 10 years ago to 87% or 90% almost this year. Very fast, but now they're having huge problems with maintaining the companies that developed it. How, I guess, it is also, it is probably more of a problem to do with the utility approach and the capabilities of the utilities in these contexts. A decentralized approach probably does work better.
I mean, on a... Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, on another level, I mean, there's examples of companies like Bbox that provide, household level off-grid solar technology.
Fantastic example.
The challenge is the unit cost is still high, which means you can only use it for the basic necessities, right? It can't provide the same level of base load, continuous availability that you would get for an on-grid solution.
Can you say more about it for those who are not familiar? Because I was hearing about it in the pre-meet, and it was really interesting.
Yeah. So it's really a pay-as-you-go off-grid solar solution where you don't rely on the utilities to provide electricity directly to the homes, which means people can control how much they use based on affordability. It's clean energy, and there are no collection issues. So I mean, it's a great model that's in parts of East Africa it's hitting 60,000 households. So it's great in that sense, but can you scale it to really deal the nationwide, or even for that matter, global issues? I think it'll play an important role. But the thing about energy, it's access and cost. You got to solve both.
Felipe, you wanted to come in?
No, just a couple of very parochial points here. Just to say, also as a comment, first, to your points that I see the logic of your point. We have a global challenge here. Let's address it, and then the more specific problems will come along. I think it makes sense logically. The reality is more messy than that.
you're right.
Because this small problem, to go to the minister's point, and Rwanda is unfortunately familiar with these population movements, has a lot of cost. It has a financial cost, it has a political cost, because it creates tension within communities. It has a stability cost for entire regions. We see it over and over again. So there is an urgency in addressing extreme, let's say not just refugees, but situation of lack of access to energy in situation of extreme fragility that make them a bit of a priority. And so it's a balance between general progress, let's say, and having to address something that, if left unattended, as the minister said, has incalculable consequences. So this is where we have the appeal. The other thing I want to say, because it's always a bit chicken and egg here, I understand very well the argument of scale. Scale makes it worthwhile for the private sector. What I said earlier, the challenge for us is not only to say, are there resources to address this, but the how. So what I fear a bit in this big discussion that we're having, including here, and especially maybe here in Davos, about humanitarian investing, about making investment attractive in risky situations, about de-risking and all that, is that it's a little bit of a dialogue de sourds, as you say in French, is two parties talking to each other. We need this, we are ready if, and nobody, we need to shake hands and move. So you have to tell us, that's how I would design it to make it attractive for me. And, and it goes both ways. So it's a very elementary point, but I think it's an important one. We need to overcome a little bit that it's not just a relationship between a customer and somebody selling something. That's a relationship. You don't talk to each other. It's a situation in which the person who sells explains to the customer how to buy it. You see what I mean? This is what we need to do. And I think that this is really the sense of the challenge.
Perfect. We just have 5 minutes, and I'm going to do just a 1 minute, fire sort of round. Let's address Filippo's question. In a year's time, back in Davos, we have another conversation around that. What is the tangible thing that can really go to what Filippo just said? What is it that we can do in the course of this year to really progress the dialogue, to make these deals starting to happen? Jose, I'll start with you.
I think if we could develop a standard model for camps,
something,
and we're working. Let me just make a clarification here. When I say that to move businesses, that sounds like to move businesses is the interest. There's some degree of philanthropy even in business. I mean,
for sure.
You
wouldn't be here otherwise.
Feeling better if we've done good than if, but we cannot afford not to have a business approach to things. And the problem we have is in this particular moment in the world with huge demand for a change in electrical generation model, we have a limitation of human capital. I mean, that is the most valuable asset companies have, is their human capital. And if we have to solve a refugee camp, which we may try to do, we're not solving another problem somewhere else because we don't have the resources. But the objective for me would be to at least solve that problem, refugee camp model, so that when your organization starts a new camp or puts up a new camp, it designs it with the appropriate mechanisms to be energy efficient.
Yeah.
Great.
And that would be at least one step up.
Perfect. Kai?
Actually, very similar in many respects. I mean, I had a long conversation with my guys around this question. And what we concluded is that there are too many desperate conversations happening in too many different places, right? And so our collective view was that the concessionary funders, businesses, the financial funders, the aid agencies need to have one conversation, and the purpose of the conversation is almost to build an off-the-shelf, let's say, let's take funding, an off-the-shelf funding solution. That if you have this situation, you pick from these 5, and everybody just slots in. But you can only do that if we're having one broad conversation that is agnostic of individual situations or regions.
Great. Minister.
I think that we should take access to energy as just a basic human right for refugees. We should take it at the level where we take access to water and sanitation for refugee camps. And I think there are solutions here and there which can be applied to in those situations. The B-Box home solar solutions he referred to a few minutes ago. Those are solutions we are using in Rwanda for the poorest people in our community. Because they don't have fridge to, they don't have those kind of appliances which need to be charged. They don't have cookers. They just have eventually a mobile phone to charge. But it works. We can consider that for refugee camps. And at least when they are settling, when we are organizing refugee camps, we need to provide these solutions and to take them into consideration as we are providing them with kits. When they arrive, we need to provide also these solutions. And I'm sure financing mechanism can be thought about, and it is just about having these as a basic, in the basic kit we are providing for refugees. We need to consider access to clean energy as well. So otherwise, if we can provide this solution for the poorest people in our communities, there will be a way to provide this solution for refugees as well.
Absolutely. Philippe.
I very much agree with this notion that was articulated in different ways, but the same one, so that in emergency situation, be it refugees, displaced, whatever, you have to have an energy reflex, basically. That's what you're all saying. I just want to introduce, just to make things a bit more interesting, at the very end, a slight element of complexity. You spoke about a blueprint, basically. Now, remember, 70% of the world refugees, these days, refugees and displaced, so there's a total of about 70 million. 70% do not live in refugee camps. They live in the community. And they add to the problems of the community in every respect, also in energy terms. So I think that we need to look at blueprints, maybe more than blueprint, because there's still situations which are camp or camp-like, like Bangladesh, where fundamentally refugees are confined in an area. But there are most other situations, refugees are in the community. Even in Jordan, which is very advanced in terms of access to clean energy for refugees in camps, it's only a small portion. All the others are in the city. And so there you need to find different solutions. And the problem, by the way, is not just for energy, it's for all kinds of services. It's for water, if there is scarcity. It's for education. It's for healthcare. The impact on, this is the big, we've just been in another meeting, this is the big impact of Venezuelan refugees all across Latin America. So I think we need to look at it in a very broad way. How do you include refugees and other people, host communities in fragile context, in national services, and how do you address these challenges in a manner that is, hits all these different buttons?
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, so much. We are at time, but I just want, to conclude. Clearly, the challenge is not an easy one to address, but there is a lot to build on. There is obviously experimentation that has happened, through more philanthropic investment. There is, really good learning from more mature markets, and there is clearly a willingness to work together, between governments, international organizations, investors, to really think how we can develop, models, plural, that can work and can, get scalable. I think that should be our commitment, for next year, for those who work in this space, to keep thinking how, we can make sure that the dialogue is more focused and, can really progress. Because as the minister reminded us, the cost of inaction really it's not one that we want to entertain. With that, thank you very much. Please join me to thank the panel for such an interesting conversation.